And the colonies is what made France what is. So that the France that you see now is a France that is built on the back of those colonies. They were harsh because their very survival depended on these colonies. And their harshness can be seen when on the eve of independence in African countries, they signed the Pact for the Continuation of Colonization. The yes-no vote for French colonies to decide whether after so-called independence they would retain connection and connectivity with Paris. They gave everybody the opportunity to vote yes or no, but they did not want you to vote no. So that when Guinea voted no under Ahmed Sékou Touré, when they were leaving, they destroyed everything that was capable of being destroyed. Modibo Keïta, in what was then the French Sudan, now Mali, they destroyed everything. Algeria, the pogrom in Algeria, when they were leaving, then led by Ahmed Ben Bella, they destroyed everything. The other countries, they continue to control. As we speak, the currencies of all former French colonies are still printed in France, CFA franc. Their cruelty, I think, comes out of a big psychological burden, which they visit, transfer of aggression. It is painful. You can see even as we speak during the coup d'etats in Africa, the arrogance. You tell a country which is equal in international law that we have accredited our ambassador, we do not care. France, the home of revolution, the home of coup d'etats at one time, can not recognize a revolution when it's taking place, and they say, accept our ambassador. We don't accept the revolution. That is France for you. Arrogance. The most arrogant of the colonial powers. You know, the history of France is the history of how the arrogance fall. If you allow me, the school bully who takes lunch from every little boy and little girl thinks that he is invincible. Then one day, the little boy says, today you are not taking my lunch. And what the little boy does is to hit you when you did not expect. And you find yourself on the ground and everybody is laughing at you. France did not see what is happening in West Africa coming. So they find themselves at a time when they are very weak economically, when at home the population of immigrants is growing bigger and bigger. You go to cities such as Marseille, you find Algerians, you find Moroccans, you find Senegalese, you find Guineans, you find Burkinabe, and things are not happening as they used to be. Then, in the former colonies that you thought you are controlling, a breed of young men and women begin rising. They rise in Guinea-Conakry, and the first thing they do is they say, we abolish all the agreements that exist between us and France. They rise in Burkina Faso, and they say the same thing. They rise in Mali, and they say the same thing. They rise in Niger, which has been providing you with uranium. Now you can't take it.
The echoes of colonial boots still reverberate across the landscapes of Latin America and the Caribbean, a haunting reminder of a past that refuses to be buried. We speak of history, but it is a history that bleeds into the present, shaping the very contours of nations and the destinies of millions. The veneer of post-colonial independence often conceals the deep, festering wounds inflicted by centuries of exploitation and cultural erasure. What unseen forces continue to bind these regions to their former oppressors? France, a nation synonymous with enlightenment and revolution, casts a long dark shadow across the annals of colonial history. Its legacy, far from being a mere footnote, is a complex tapestry woven with threads of cultural arrogance, economic plunder, and political manipulation. The narrative extends beyond the familiar tropes of resource extraction, delving into the insidious realm of cultural assimilation, a form of subjugation that sought to erase indigenous identities and replace them with a French facsimile. Are we truly aware of the depths of this cultural theft and its enduring impact? The specter of slavery, a stain on humanity's conscience, looms large in this narrative. Beyond the brutal chains and forced labor, We must confront the enduring psychological and economic scars that continue to haunt the descendants of those enslaved. The reparations demanded from Haiti, a nation born from revolution, stand as a chilling testament to the enduring power of colonial debt, a burden that continues to stifle its progress. What are the unseen mechanisms that perpetuate this cycle of economic bondage? The raw materials that fuel France's modern economy, the uranium and other vital resources, are often extracted from the very lands that were once subjected to its colonial rule. This symbiotic relationship, a legacy of exploitation, raises profound questions about the true cost of progress and the ethical dimensions of global trade. Are we complicit in a system that perpetuates historical injustices, and what are the hidden prices that are paid? Prepare to embark on a journey that transcends the conventional narratives of colonialism. This is not a mere history lesson, but an exploration of the enduring power dynamics that continue to shape the world we inhabit. Uncover the hidden truths, challenge your assumptions, and confront the uncomfortable realities of a past that refuses to fade. What are the unseen forces that bind the past to the present, and what are the implications for our shared future?
South America, sometimes called Latin America, and of course the neighboring area, which is Central America and the Caribbean, has a very interesting history. I remember when we were being taught history, that was called the New World. New because it is the Spaniards specifically who went to that area. And it must never be forgotten that Christopher Columbus, who is said to have discovered the New World, was actually on his way to India. He got lost. And when he met the indigenous Americans, he called them the Red Indians because he thought he was in India. But that in itself makes that part of the world very unique because they were empires which had been built. The Aztecs were there, the Arahuacans. If you look at what is now Mexico, they were the mestizos, they were the Aztecs, complete with civilization. The Arahuacans were to be found in what is today Honduras, in Colombia, in Costa Rica, in Panama, in Nicaragua. So there were people in that part of the world, complete with civilizations. And the Arahuacans, of course, we know, were completely decimated by the Spaniards. The Spaniards went there, and the Spaniards were in Mexico, what is today Mexico, in Nicaragua. They were in Honduras, in Colombia, and of course the Portuguese then found their way in what is today Brazil. The British somehow found their way in modern-day Belize. And the French also found themselves in areas such as the Suriname. And even the Dutch found themselves in what is called the Dutch Antilles. So these new lands became the subject of slavery initially because the local peoples were decimated deliberately by military action and also by disease, because these individuals came with certain diseases which were unknown in that part of the world, particularly the Spaniards and the British, as I've already said, and the net effect is that whole populations were dominated and completely eliminated in certain cases, so that if you go into the Arahuacans now, the people who are called the Arahuacans, who then moved into the island that is called St. Vincent's and Grenadines. Their language was wiped away, but is now being revived. If you hear of a language called the Garifuna, that is the language which is spoken by the Arahuacans. But most of the slaves that then found themselves in that part of the world were slaves that were taken to that part of the world. When they had decimated the local population, that is why the Portuguese now started taking people to Brazil. And Brazilians, if you go to Brazil, there is a very large population of Yorubas. There is also a very large population of Ovambo and of Imbundu from what is today Angola and also Mozambique. So once again, you can see it is the colonizers who are coming from their colonies or the areas that they had conquered in the African continent and taking them to Latin America. The Spaniards also took people from their colonies in different, and some of them were not even their colonies, but they took them from Africa in the area that is now called Equatorial Guinea. A lot of Equatorial Guineans were taken out of there, and Sao Tome and Principe, and we find them in the Spanish colony. The British, of course, as we know, took their people from their slaves from Ghana, from Nigeria, from the Gambia, and from Liberia, and from Sierra Leone, and they found themselves in Trinidad and Tobago. In Trinidad and Tobago, you find a large population of people who are of Igbo origin and Yoruba origin. And in Jamaica, you also find those. In fact, there is a place in Jamaica in the mountains where you have the commandos. These were slaves who ran away and went to the mountain, and they became free even in that environment. So you find those in the Caribbean. So you find populations in Trinidad and Tobago, Antigua and Barbuda, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and Grenadines, and of course Suriname and Dutch Antilles, all the European powers, because at that time sugarcane was huge. And those islands were very good for the growing of sugar. They also became very good for the growing of bananas. You had the term banana republic. There was a time when countries such as Honduras, Colombia were big for bananas. Even as we speak today, some of the bananas that you find are either from Honduras, Chiquita, you find them from Costa Rica. These were places that were rich in those products, and coffee. And of course, these then became the target where you took some of the slaves, and slavery was alive and well in that particular area, and they were enslaved during that particular area. Then the era of decolonization, I think it is in the month of September 1812. That is the period when all the Central Americans regained their independence in 1812. And it was through the activities, the decolonization process started with people like Simon Bolivar, who is, if you find many of the states there, you'll find a man called, like Venezuela actually calls itself the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. And I think Bolivia is actually named after Simon Bolivar. So these were the individuals who then started the idea of fighting this, both after slavery, the decolonization, and of course the much younger people will remember Ernesto Che Guevara. And we don't mention Cuba in the mix. Cuba was also, of course, controlled by the Spaniards. We have not mentioned Bahamas in the mix. All these were countries that suffered under classical slavery and subsequently colonization by the Western European powers, to be specific. You know, slavery is a very bad thing, and there were different forms of it. When we speak about slavery, sometimes we talk about slavery as if there was a uniform way of dealing with slaves across the colonized and the enslaved societies. Each of the powers, European powers, during the days of slavery had their own way, because they remember slavery and there was slave trade. So that if you went into the areas where the Portuguese were, or where the Spaniards were, or where the Dutch were, or where the English were, you discovered that even when you regained your freedom, really you did not regain it. Your master still had control over you. And laws such as that were laws which were designed to ensure that you continue slavery. And the reason was this: it is not everybody who agreed to the abolition of slavery. So that even when slave trade had been abolished, slavery still continued. The only thing that stopped is that you could no longer legitimately sell human beings as commodities. But slavery remained, and as we speak, remains now. So in many of those parts of the world, you still had enslavers who could come for you. You are free, but they can come for you and take you, and you work in their farms, and they deal with you as they deem fit. Sometimes the only thing they gave you was food. And the Portuguese were terrible at this. The Spaniards were terrible at this. The English pretended, of course, after the abolition, that they were no longer doing this. But some of their remnants continue to behave in this way, particularly in the islands. Because in the islands, they did not have as much control as they had in the metropole in England or in the larger part of the United States. So it's true that all manner of laws were enacted. In the United States, we have the Dred Scott Law. All these laws were being passed because you said slavery and slave trade had stopped, but there are people who are continuing with it. And if they are continuing with it and they are like it, how do you know? And you are dealing with slaves who have nothing. They do not know where to go. They can't go to their homes in Africa where they came from. They don't have guns. They don't have houses. They don't have means. Sometimes some of them preferred even to go back to their masters because at least under those masters, they had food on the table. Outside, it was wild, and they did not know what to happen. And they were also slave hunters, people who continued to hunt people who had free, and they hunted and brought them down to the slave camps. Haiti is a very sad state, the first black African country to regain independence, and we know the great Haitian independence fighter, Toussaint de Louverture. That was the man who defeated Napoleon, and he was never forgiven for that. When he defeated Napoleon, the French never forgave him, and of course they were granted independence in 1890s, and it was black-dominated. And remember, we don't say much about this. If you look at the map of Haiti, you have the Dominican Republic, Santo Domingo, which was then the white population was moved to Santo Domingo, and Port-au-Prince, which is the capital of Haiti, became the part of Haiti, or the part of the capital of Haiti, which was completely dominated by black. Many of them from Benin, what is now Benin, which used to be called Dahomey. And you will discover that they actually retained most of their culture. But the French have ensured, and the French swore that Haiti will never know peace. That they humiliated us by defeating Napoleon, they will never know peace. So at independence, Toussaint Louverture signed that they would be paying money to the French as compensation. I think it was, if it is not him, but I think the Ceylan, one of them signed, and Haiti continued to pay reparation. You remember, I mean, somebody has enslaved you. Somebody has colonized you, and when they are leaving, they say you owe them. And it is as if there was a conspiracy amongst the white powers in that part of the world, because when the French left, there was a period in 1905, I think, for a few years, when the Americans actually occupied Haiti and dominated Haiti. If they had wanted Haiti to prosper, they would have ensured that it did. But they did not. And after that, of course, we know how they presided over the occupation of Haiti by some of the most abusive leaders the world have ever known, Jean-Claude Duvalier, called Papa Doc, who used a combination of voodoo and violence to dominate Haiti. And I remember as a young man, we used to hear about Jean-Claude Duvalier, Papa Doc. And after that, of course, we had the son, Baby Doc, who dominated Haiti. And it was all violence, it was all voodoo, and Haiti remained poor and impoverished. So that when in the late 1980s and early 1990s, there was a movement now to try and stabilize Haiti. And there came a man who was a Catholic priest, Jean-Baptiste Aristide, who tried to change Haiti, to try to create order in Haiti. He was removed. Jean-Baptiste Aristide was removed, and then later he was brought back, and I think at time, I think he even came to and lived in South Africa, Jean-Baptiste Aristide. And he went back, and Europe and America, France and America have ensured that Haiti is the way it is. Now, Haiti is a land of gangs. Everybody occupying their own little corner. It is, if you talk of a failed nation, if you talk of an ungovernable nation, Haiti is. And that is on the doorsteps of a country that claimed that is the strongest country on earth. One would have assumed that if there was ever a case of a country that needed the intervention of the world through the UN, to simply go there and say that this is a US mandated administration and we administer Haiti for the next 25 years, when it is stabilized, then we will give it back to the people. I give you this, the history and what is contemporary, that it may be understood that slavery and colonization and its impact are things that are with us. They are not things that we read in history books. You open any major television, you'll see what is happening in Haiti now. Gangs in Port-au-Prince with AK-47s and other military-grade equipment and machetes in the streets. When you sleep in Port-au-Prince, one eye must be open, courtesy of the legacy of slavery and, of course, colonization, and, of course, neo-colonization, and, of course, the vow that was made by the French, Haiti will never know peace. The French are a unique people. Unique in the sense that they claim that France is the mother of modern-day revolution, with the French Revolution in 18th century. Liberté, fraternité. That was France during the revolution, and that they exported this revolution to the world. Yet somehow, France is the worst of the colonizers from all objective assessments. Of course, Samora Moises Machel said it is wrong to categorize slave makers as one being better than the other. But permit me to say that they were the worst. Number one, unlike the British, who simply were interested in your resources and therefore engaged in what was called direct rule, the French wanted to assimilate you. So their policy was assimilation. They came to the colonies and they wanted to convert you into French men and French women. And in school parades in the colonized parts of the world by the French, like Senegal, like Mali, like Burkina Faso, which was then Upper Volta, like Togo and Benin and Suriname, during the parade in the morning, pupils used to recite our ancestors, the Gauls. A black pupil saying that their ancestors were the Gauls. They wanted you to speak French. And once they had picked a few of you and took them to the Sorbonne, you had to be a total Frenchman or a total Frenchwoman. They came to different parts of the world and they created what they call the Petit Paris. Abidjan is Petit Paris, the small Paris. And their colonies were actually called overseas territories, les territoires d'outre-mer. They called them overseas territories, being administered from the metropole. The French never intended to leave. They never intended to leave Suriname. They never intended to leave Vietnam. They never intended to leave Senegal or Mali or Guinea-Conakry. And they were vicious. They punished you. They humiliated you. They did not want you to speak your language. I do not know why they were that harsh. Perhaps it's because of their history. Remember, this is a country that had kings. This is a country that had Marie Antoinette. This is a country that had King Louis the 16th, and there was a time it is King Louis the 14th who at one time when he was asked, and what is the state? I think that is that experience. King Louis the 14th, when they were controlling France, he was asked, and what is the state? He said, l'état, c'est moi. I am the state. And when later King Louis the 16th and Marie Antoinette came, the French were humiliated. When the people asked where we want bread, they say, why don't they eat cake? And I think that history, that pain, when they created the revolution, I think in 1789, and they created the revolution, France was humiliated during the war by the Germans, and when therefore they became colonialists, they were visiting this pain upon the world. And as early as 1958, as recently as 1958, when they recalled Charles de Gaulle to come and take over power in 1958, remember when Charles de Gaulle came, this was a military general. This is the height of decolonization. He used military force in order to retain the French colonies. And the colonies is what made France what is. So that the France that you see now is a France that is built on the back of those colonies. They were harsh because their very survival depended on these colonies. And their harshness can be seen when, on the eve of independence in African countries, they signed the Pact for the Continuation of Colonization. The yes-no vote for French colonies to decide whether after so-called independence they would retain connection and connectivity with Paris. They gave everybody the opportunity to vote yes or no, but they did not want you to vote no. So that when Guinea voted no under Ahmed Sékou Touré, when they were leaving, they destroyed everything that was capable of being destroyed. Modibo Keïta, in what was then the French Sudan, now Mali, they destroyed everything. Algeria, the pogrom in Algeria, when they were leaving, then led by Ahmed Ben Bella, they destroyed everything. The other countries, they continue to control. As we speak, the currencies of all former French colonies are still printed in France, CFA franc. Their cruelty, I think, comes out of a big psychological burden, which they visit, transfer of aggression. It is painful. You can see even as we speak during the coup d'etats in Africa, the arrogance. You tell a country which is equal in international law that we have accredited our ambassador, we do not care. France, the home of revolution, the home of coup d'etats at one time, can not recognize a revolution when it's taking place, and they say, accept our ambassador. We don't accept the revolution. That is France for you. Arrogance. The most arrogant of the colonial powers. You know, the history of France is the history of how the arrogance fall. If you allow me, the school bully who takes lunch from every little boy and little girl thinks that he is invincible. Then one day, the little boy says, today you are not taking my lunch. And what the little boy does is to hit you when you did not expect. And you find yourself on the ground and everybody is laughing at you. France did not see what is happening in West Africa coming. So they find themselves at a time when they are very weak economically, when at home the population of immigrants is growing bigger and bigger. You go to cities such as Marseille, you find Algerians, you find Moroccans, you find Senegalese, you find Guineans, you find Burkinabe, and things are not happening as they used to be. Then, in the former colonies that you thought you are controlling, a breed of young men and women begin rising. They rise in Guinea-Conakry, and the first thing they do is they say, we abolish all the agreements that exist between us and France. They rise in Burkina Faso and they say the same thing. They rise in Mali and they say the same thing. They rise in Niger, which has been providing you with uranium. Now you can't take it. I think they cannot take it because they are losing food which has been inside of their mouth. And they do not know how to behave. As somebody once said, without Africa, there is no France. Without our former colonies, give France only 20 years, and it will be one of the poorest nations in the continent of Europe. And that is going to happen. And they are resisting because for them this is life and death. But the stars, which I can now perfectly read, are telling me that their goose is cooked, and very well cooked. The story of South America or Latin America or Central America is unique. Unique in the sense that most of the people who now occupy Latin America are all not indigenous to Latin America. The Arawakans and the mestizos who are indigenous, they are very few and far between. Whether you go to Mexico, you'll find them, but they are very few. The Aztecs and their descendants, very few. If you go to places such as Nicaragua, the Aborigines are very few. You go to Mexico, they are very few. So that if you go to many of these places, go to Brazil, for example, which has one of the largest black populations anywhere in the world, over 133 million. And of course, there are very many people of Portuguese origin and people from different parts of the world. So these are all immigrants who have in large integrated and to the extent that is possible, even being racist, it does not make sense. You see quite some integration there. The same is true in Colombia. We now have, even the vice president of Colombia is African. The same is true of Honduras. The same is true largely of Chile. And we have, of course, we have seen recent problems in Peru because of you remember Peru, even at one time their president was somebody of Japanese origin, Alberto Fujimori, who was from Japan. But there is one unique Latin American country that we don't talk about, Argentina. Argentina deliberately decided to whiten the population. So most of the coloreds and blacks in Argentina were eliminated. But the point is that Latin America underwent several problems. You remember there was a time when coup d'etats were the thing in Latin America, whether it was in Brazil, it was a military government, whether it was in Uruguay, coup d'etat, in Argentina, coup d'etat, Honduras, coup d'etat, Chile, coup d'etat, Peru, coup d'etat, in Central America, Nicaragua, coup d'etat, Panama, coup d'etat, Costa Rica, civil war until 1948, Mexico. And I think there was a period when, after the coup d'etats and after the activities of revolutionaries such as Simón Bolívar and Ernesto Che Guevara, even in places such as Venezuela, there was a period of settlement. And I think that is largely why Latin America has its own race problems, but they are not as pronounced as they are pronounced in other parts of the world. People suffered together. And I think when you suffer together, there is a sense in which some camaraderie begins to emerge. And that, in a very simplistic way, in my view, explains why, indeed, there is some kind of understanding amongst the races. Of course, when you go deeper inside, there'll always be people who feel, oh, we are not being treated right, things are not right, but largely people coexist. And we have seen that over a long period, even in areas where you thought that there would be problems in the political arena, in the economic arena, you have fairly reasonable representation. Latin America's history must also be understood in the context of the revolutionary spirit. and when there was a bipolar world, and I want to explain Latin America in the following ways. That if you look at Brazil, for example, which was colonized by Portugal, which was one of the weakest and poorest nations in Europe, there was a time when Portugal actually depended on Brazil in the 1900 and in the mid 1990s, when Portugal itself had coups. You remember in the 60s, the coup that was mounted against Marcelo Caetano by Antonio de Spinola until 1977, when I was myself a primary school child, and I knew that there was instability. So these countries freed themselves very early, and they did not want to be like Europe. They did not want hard-nosed capitalism like Europe. They wanted societies that were a little bit more egalitarian. So you can see that through the policies of Brazil in those early days. And if you go to places like Chile, when the revolution started taking place, you see people like Salvador Allende. When Allende was in power, Allende was a socialist. And of course, he was murdered almost 30 years ago from this year. And then the Americans imposed Augusto Pinochet. And we can also remember the socialist movement in Argentina during the period of Juan Perón. And socialism was also the way to go in those days. And then if you look at what we now call the Bolivarian republics, Venezuela, which led to people like Hugo Chavez. You look at Bolivia, to Rios. You look at Panama, Omar Rios, who was a socialist. And you look at Nicaragua with Ortega. And so you can see a Latin America that very early on was very different. They say, we think when you are socialist, you take care of social welfare things. You take care of education, you take care of health, you take care of these basic things. And I think that is now serving them well. A little country such as Costa Rica, with a population of 5 million, has free healthcare, free education. And what do they have to export? Is just bananas and tourism. 1948, they don't even have an army. They abolished an army. And you remember that in the early days, I think it is in the early 1900s, mid-1900s, they entered into the Rio de Janeiro Pact, which says that if you attack anyone who is the Rio de Janeiro Pact, then you attack all. So a combination of factors made Latin America very different. The Americans always wanted to treat Latin America as their backyard. And they feared, of course, that socialism during the days of the Soviet Union, that the Soviet Union was in Cuba, Soviet Union was everywhere. So there was always this resistance. And people hated the capitalists in Latin America. And that is why those who claimed to be socialists were in ascendance. And when government settled, they did not ignore what are socialist policies. And that continues even as they suffer here and there to serve them reasonably well. That is not to say that you don't have problems in Nicaragua, or that you don't have problems in Peru, or that you don't have problems in Bolivia, or that you don't have problems in Colombia or Uruguay or Argentina. You do. But the orientation of Venezuela, the orientation is socialist, but the intermeddling of America is ever present. You know, when you don't obey America, they want to ensure that you fail. And they do that quite well.
PLO Lumumba's dissection of France's colonial legacy serves as a stark reminder of the enduring impact of historical injustices on the contemporary world. His narrative extends beyond a mere recitation of historical events, delving into the intricate web of economic exploitation, cultural assimilation, and political manipulation that characterized French colonialism. The focus is not only on the physical subjugation of colonized populations, but also on the insidious erosion of their cultural identities and the systematic extraction of their resources. The narrative commences with the devastating impact of European arrival on indigenous civilizations in the Americas, The Spaniards, under Columbus, initiated a pattern of conquest and disease that decimated populations like the Arawak and Aztecs, laying the groundwork for centuries of exploitation. This initial encounter, marked by violence and cultural disregard, set the stage for the transatlantic slave trade, a system that fundamentally reshaped the demographic landscape of the Americas. The transatlantic slave trade, involving multiple European nations, including France, stands as a testament to the brutality of colonial exploitation. The forced transportation of Africans to the Americas, primarily for sugar cultivation, created societies marked by deep racial and economic inequalities. This legacy of slavery continues to shape the social and political dynamics of the region, highlighting the enduring consequences of historical injustices. Even after the formal abolition of slavery, its legacy persisted in subtler but equally damaging forms. Lumumba highlights how countries like Portugal, Spain, and England maintained oppressive systems that used legal mechanisms to disguise ongoing exploitation. This continuity of oppression underscores the adaptability of colonial power, which evolved to maintain its grip on resources and labor. France's post-independence treatment of Haiti stands as a particularly egregious example of colonial exploitation. Haiti's hard-won independence was immediately burdened by crippling reparations demanded by France, a debt that effectively shackled the nascent nation's economy. The subsequent U.S. occupation and support for oppressive regimes further destabilized Haiti, leaving a legacy of political turmoil and economic hardship. France's colonial approach differed from that of the British, focusing on cultural assimilation rather than direct resource extraction. This involved imposing French language, education, and culture on colonized populations, attempting to transform them into French men and women. This assimilation policy, however, represented a form of cultural violence, erasing indigenous identities and imposing a foreign worldview. The arrogance and detachment of French rulers, exemplified by figures like King Louis XIV and Louis XVI, fueled resentment and resistance among colonized populations. This disconnect between the ruling class and the colonized masses culminated in violent struggles for independence. Even during decolonization, France maintained control through military force and manipulative agreements, hindering true self-determination. The economic dimension of French colonialism is starkly illustrated by France's reliance on African resources, particularly uranium. Lumumba argues that without these resources, France's economic and political status would be severely diminished. This dependence underscores the enduring legacy of colonial exploitation, which continues to shape contemporary power dynamics. The historical context of colonialism also sheds light on the racial dynamics of Latin America. The summary mentions Argentina's attempts to whiten its population, a policy that reflects the enduring influence of colonial hierarchies. Despite these historical challenges, Lumumba notes a sense of racial camaraderie and coexistence in Latin America, a testament to the shared experience of suffering and resilience. The influence of socialism in Latin America, shaped by U.S. intervention and unique national policies, further complicates the region's political landscape. Countries like Costa Rica, with their emphasis on free healthcare and education, demonstrate the potential for alternative development models. The U.S. fear of socialism led to interventions in countries like Venezuela, highlighting the ongoing struggle for political and economic autonomy. Lumumba's analysis, therefore, paints a comprehensive picture of France's colonial legacy, revealing its multifaceted impact on the political, economic, and cultural landscapes of Latin America and the Caribbean. It serves as a stark reminder of the enduring consequences of historical injustices and the ongoing struggle for true independence. The legacy of French colonialism is not merely a historical footnote. It continues to shape contemporary power dynamics and economic inequalities. The extraction of resources, the imposition of cultural norms, and the manipulation of political systems have left enduring scars on the colonized nations. Lumumba's discourse serves as a call to acknowledge the enduring consequences of colonial exploitation and to work towards a more equitable and just world. It underscores the importance of understanding history to address contemporary challenges. The narrative serves as a warning against the dangers of unchecked power and the enduring impact of historical injustices. It calls for a critical examination of colonial legacies and a commitment to dismantling the structures of inequality that they have created. In essence, Lumumba provides a vital historical perspective, illustrating how the past continues to shape the present, and emphasizing the need for a deeper understanding of colonial legacies to forge a more equitable future.